Okay, so we're going to go around and we're going to ask you, well, not ask, you're going to say what your name is, what your major was when you went to AU, and what your current job is. So, Amelia, you start.
I majored in secondary English language arts education with minors in special ed and TESOL, and my current job is 8th grade English at Alexandria Monroe Schools.
I'm Hannah. I majored in elementary education with a minor in special education. And where I work now, I'm actually at a school for students with disabilities, and I'm a MD teacher, which is a multiple disability teacher for transitional students. So I service 18 to 22-year-olds. So it's completely not what I studied, but it is at the same time.
Awesome. Alyssa.
I am Alyssa Page. I have a degree in elementary education and a minor in special education. I work for a company called Easter Seals, and I'm an autism training specialist. I basically teach parents of kids with autism how to work with their kids and then set up all of the systems and routines for their kids.
Nice. Ashley.
I'm Ashley. I majored in elementary education with a minor in special education, and I currently am teaching Indianapolis Public Schools. I'm a K through 3rd inclusion teacher.
Excellent. Okay, now we're just going to go right into the first question. What is the one thing you would have paid more attention to before starting your student teaching semester?
Okay, so if I had to pick one thing I would have paid more attention to, it probably would have been like what the school's about. I would have known more content about what, like I went to Elwood and I had no idea what Elwood, like what they stand for, what like their disciplinary thing is, and I would have done a lot more research into that before picking where I went.
Good. Anyone else want to pitch in?
I mean, if I'm being completely honest, I think that, I don't know if everybody else agrees that's on this panel, but I think AU prepares you really, really, really well. And I don't think there was anything I was like, oh my gosh, I did not know that. I wish I would have paid more attention to.
Can you read the question one more time, Maggie? Sorry.
Yeah, what is one thing you would have paid more attention to before starting your student teaching semester?
Do you mean like about the school or about like what we learned in classes? I definitely would have paid more attention when they talked about the co-teaching, and that the school that I am at does a lot with co-teaching. And I felt like I had some grasp on it, but definitely I did not understand the idea of like setting boundaries with your co-teacher and respectfully like, hey, I need you to do this, but not this.
I think for me, it wasn't necessarily like what I wish I would have paid more attention to. It's more like I should have asked more questions, because like I'm like the type of person that like just like is afraid to ask questions if I actually do have a question, or I just don't speak up for myself. So I feel like I could have learned more asking questions, and I did utilize the professors a lot, but I feel like I could have asked more questions about things that I wasn't quite sure of. But yeah.
What is one piece of advice you would give another student going into student teaching?
Give yourself grace.
I have something.
Oh.
It's not as bad as people make it out to be. You make it what it is. So like if you're willing to work and not put things off, it's not that bad. But if you wait till the last minute when things are due, when you have journals due and stuff, and you cram things all in at once, you kind of put the stress. Stop it. you kind of put the stress on yourself. And so like I was just hearing like horror story after horror story. So I was so nervous going into student teaching, not knowing what to expect. And it actually wasn't that bad because, like, I mean, we've been studying it for 3.5 years. And so by the time you get to it, it's kind of just like natural. And so I feel like it's not as bad as people say it is. So don't stress about it.
I was just going to say, give yourself grace because you don't know everything and you're not going to know everything. And so just being willing to ask questions and give yourself grace. I don't know about any of you, but I'm a perfectionist and I want everything to be perfect in the way it should be. And student teaching some days can be a hot mess. Just like teaching normally.
Yeah, I would say if there is one, like, rephrase the question because I want to make sure I answer the question, not just speak.
What is one piece of advice you would give to another student going into student teaching?
Try everything. If you think that you have an idea on a lesson and you're like, well, it might not work, it might not, like, this is your time to try because this is the time that you're going to have the most support. You have people there that are like, so this really, really didn't work, but how can we rework it to do it again? And you have professors still, you have your teachers, you have the teachers' friends that you're making, you have all of your peers. Student teaching, you are so, so supported. And try and fail because this is the time that you're able to pick back up. So try and fail and be okay with failure. It's going to happen. It's part of it. And it's not a bad thing. You're learning so much from the failures.
I think going off what Alyssa said, when you student teach too, you need to make sure you have your support system because you are going to have some hard days. And so your people who you can go to, that's AU professors, if that's also like other student teaching people, but like having your support system of the people you go to when you're having a bad day. And when you even like, I had people that I talked to when I needed to come up with lesson plan ideas, like just having those people you can bounce ideas off of and you have your support system.
Amelia, you can say something.
I don't know if anyone said it or not. I know Alyssa touched on it, but don't be afraid of failure. You'll learn just as much from that as from the things that succeed. Very quickly, you'll start to learn what works and what doesn't work, and that is so good.
What part of student teaching prepared you the most for your current job?
So I had kind of a crazy situation. Like my student teaching placement was in 6th grade and it was all over the place. We broke up fights. It was crazy. I mean, there were fights that happened all the time. We were trying to keep students separated. And in my job now, I feel like I'm trained in restraints and how to handle XYZ situations. And I think being put in a school situation where there are fights and kids just will straight up tell you no, like I grew up in a school district where I couldn't imagine telling a teacher no. What do you mean? The teacher told me to do that. And that's the biggest joke. That is not what happened with me. And I think that right there really, really prepared me because otherwise, like the job that I'm in now, I walk into situations and kids might be throwing tables and knocking down couches. And I'm teaching the parents how to handle that kind of stuff. So I would say that those prepared me. Also, I'm sorry if I forgot the question again. So just go ahead.
Yeah, so with what part of teaching prepared you the most for your current job? And Alyssa said, like the fights during student teaching, which she wasn't used to, and knowing how to like kind of handle those situations, which is really big in her job now. All right. So how did student teaching, what part of student teaching prepared you the most for your current job, Amelia?
Being willing to ask questions and letting your teacher you're working with critique you and like being okay with hearing the things that you're not doing well, even though sometimes that's hard, is really helpful. Like really listening to what they have to say and then asking questions. So if they say something to you and you're like, I have no idea what they mean, ask. Like asking is good.
Amelia said being willing to ask questions, and letting people critique you and be willing to hear things that might be hard and ask questions. So, what part of student teaching prepared you the most for your current job, Ashley?
Well, my student teaching was interesting because of COVID. I didn't really student teach special ed, which I'm now student teaching, or I'm now teaching. So really all I student taught was gen ed. And so probably for my gen ed experience, it was like what Alyssa talked about, a lot of the behavior that has really helped and prepared me for where I'm at now. And then also I worked really well with my clinical educator. And so we had some students who are really, really low. And so finding strategies and evidence-based practices that we could utilize to help give those students small group interventions. I mean, that's what I do every day now. So that probably was what prepared me the most.
Hannah, what part of student teaching prepared you the most for your current job?
I can't hear Ashley, so I'm sorry if I repeat, but just the fact that, I mean, I didn't really get to student teach like Ashley did in special education. I got cut off like right when I was switching and we went online. And the fact that I'm teaching special education, it's kind of hard. So I used more of like my management skills and strategies that I got out of student teaching. And a lot of my students are still at that level that I was student teaching in. I was in second grade and I have students who are in second grade reading levels and stuff. So like being able to use the materials that I used in student teaching and resources, that has kind of like kept me afloat this year so far. But I really wish that I would have had my special education like section of student teaching more in depth, because I think that's the part I'm struggling with the most in my new job. So.
Okay. And Hannah said that she didn't get the student teaching expelled either because of COVID and like having a lower level education, like general ed placement definitely gave her resources because it's kind of the same in some aspects. And so we'll move on to the next question. No, we won't. I'm getting pointed. What is a clinical educator? Could someone answer that? Maybe Ashley, since I think she brought that up.
So a clinical educator is like your classroom teacher. It's the person in charge of the classroom. And so you'll work with your clinical educator while you're student teaching. And if you hear the terminology US, that's your university supervisor. So that's the person from Anderson University. It's not a professor necessarily. They have Professor Tatum has university supervisors that he oversees. And so you'll have a university supervisor. And so your university supervisor will come in and they'll evaluate you, but your clinical educator is essentially who you're with every single day, and they will give you the most feedback on your teaching.
How did student teaching impact your view of the teaching profession? Would, Hannah, do you want to start?
Thanks, Maggie. Let's see. It impacted my view of teaching. It gave me some confidence, I would say, because my student teaching was a little bit different. My clinical educator, like the teacher that I was paired with, actually was out for surgery on my third day of student teaching, and I took over my class for 3 weeks. And so I kind of like just was like the main teacher. And it kind of gave me like that confidence and that view that like this is what I was meant to do, and like I'm glad that I decided to go on this path of my life. And it gave me kind of like a boost in motivation to keep going, and it has helped me like be a teacher now because I knew I could do it during student teaching. And like the best feeling in student teaching is when you do take over, like, and you go from like the beginning of the day to the end of the day and you teach everything. It's like such a good feeling because you've been waiting for that for so long, it feels like. And so like after so much like work, it's finally paid off. And so like it gave me like a positive view.
So my view of the teaching profession after student teaching kind of broke my heart. because I would go and see all of these kids that didn't have anything set up. Like I would set up all these interventions, or I would call home and nobody was answering and nothing was being done at home. So for 7 hours a day, I knew they were taken care of, but what about the rest? Like when they go home, what are they walking in the door to? And just seeing that truly broke my heart. And I think that's honestly led me to where I'm at now, because now I get to do the whole thing. So instead of just school, I'm working with the parents on you name it. We get to do everything and try and like build them up from the base. And when they go home, like I get to work with teachers and like, this is what we know is working at home, so try to implement in school. So we're like getting to put things all on the same page, because I love student teaching, but it really opened my eyes and broke my heart to how broken the system is, if that makes sense.
Well, I think student teaching taught me a lot, but I think one of the like big takeaways I had from student teaching was like the importance of having a strong teaching team and a strong support system within that teaching team. Because I had a really strong clinical educator, I had a really strong, like our second grade team was pretty strong. And then I heard stories of people who didn't have that. And I think that those positive interactions, that collaboration you do is really what makes or breaks your experience. Not even student teaching, but in like the professional setting. Like I have a really, really good co-inclusion teacher, then we work together and collaborate all the time. And so I think just the importance of that strong teamwork and having those people you collaborate with and having your PLCs, professional learning communities, where you have that intentional time to collaborate and to work together with your team and making sure you seek out that team to work with.
We're taught a lot about how administration make or break a school community, and how whether or not they have their teachers' backs and they're looking out for their students. That's all really important, but I didn't necessarily understand it until I was in a place that had a administration that really backed them. I got some of that through our practicums, but it wasn't the same. When I was in it, I was watching him go check in on teachers and make sure students were good. And his presence in the building is definitely apparent. And you can tell that they not only have their teachers' backs, but they have the best interests of their students as well.
How do you feel the COVID student-teacher experience prepared you for what you're doing now? And Amelia, you can start it off.
So when COVID first hit, I was almost all the way through student teaching because I started early. So I got to see and help out with a little bit of the online learning. I have the students that I student taught with, they're my students this year. So as their teacher this year, not only did I see that as a student teacher that they weren't necessarily getting everything they needed because it just wasn't possible, but I'm feeling that as a first year teacher. Their knowledge gap, along with, I also knew where they ended, which was nice because I knew where the knowledge stopped. I had like the documentation, I had their end of the year assessment, but I was also in that space with them, which was really helpful going into this year. It's also really weird to see students with masks on. It sounds weird, but it's hard now. Like if I go to one of their games or something, it's hard to see what their face actually looks like. So,
Alyssa, how do you feel the COVID student-teacher experience prepared you for your job, since it is not as like much the typical route that, you know?
So for my job, I was switching right over to my student teaching placement, to my special ed placement the day that everything kind of hit the fan and all the schools were canceled, and mine was the only one not canceled that day. And we got to do packets, and I think that day was really, really good because I got to see like the sped teachers truly get all of the stuff back because all the gen ed teachers made all the packets and the sped teachers are given the stuff and they're like, okay, now make accommodations for it. And so it was kind of crazy to see that. Other than that, I didn't do much for my placement because it was kind of uncharted waters. And the only thing my school was doing, because we didn't want to assign extra work, was having open hours to text or email or have like FaceTimes to call. And I never had a single kid show up to any of those, but none of them knew me either. I hadn't met any of them, so I didn't have any time to build rapport or do anything. So COVID really did not help me in that case.
So I think COVID student teaching, I think the key word was flexibility and I don't know and uncertainty. And I started my first teaching position 100% virtually. And so I have just taught virtually for 8 weeks. And you don't know this, all these school districts that started virtual, COVID spring virtual and COVID fall virtual don't look the same. So we've been online all day, every day from 9 a.m. to 3:30 p.m. And so there's been lots of flexibility and lots of uncertainties and lots of I don't knows, but everybody's in that place. Nobody has the answers, admin, nobody, because it's all new. And so just learning together and being willing to be flexible.
I think I was like Alyssa in a way, like I switched right over like during the time. And so I was just able to see the lack of communication that my school had with students. And I was just like, how is this even considered like school? Like, how are they getting credit? Because there was just like days where it would just be me and my special education, at the teacher I was with and no students. And I was like, how are we meeting these students' accommodations and how is this even legal? Because like if a student has an accommodation, like you have to like do all you can to do that. And especially some students who have IEPs and certain disabilities, it is so hard for them to do online learning, and I was able to see that. And so going into my job now, luckily we're full in person. We started in person. I only had 3 students, so it's kind of easy to be in person. But I was just able to like not take for granted what we have and really like prepare my students that if we happen to go online, like that I have everything I need and able to support them in their needs. Because I don't know how my students could do online work. I have nonverbal students who only have a communication device at school, and I just don't know how to do it. So it's definitely given me like a perspective of like how to teach and how to be flexible, and just like it's so unknown. So I feel like it's also making us stronger as teachers too. Like if we can make it through this, like we can make it through anything. So like this is a heck of a first year, that's for sure.
So the last question is, what would you say was the biggest challenge with your student teaching experience? And Alyssa, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I would say the biggest challenge of student teaching was seeing the completely different school district, the way that it ran completely differently, the way that positive interactions were used, and like I don't know how to even explain it, but like the kids in my classroom felt that if they were like the question that was always asked, and my CE, my clinical educator always told me, she was like, well, why are they going to do that? I'm like, well, what do you mean why? Because I told them to, like that's the homework assignment. And so I would say the biggest challenge was giving a reason, because the real answer is like there needs to be a reason to that. Nobody wants to do something they're not going to. And so always having an answer to that question, like why are they going to do that? Is it for a grade? That might not be a good answer. Is it for a pizza party reward party? That might be an it. But always coming up with the answer of like, why are they going to do that? How can you convince them to do that?
Well, I mean, obviously COVID-19, but probably just dealing with behavior. The building I was in had lots of behavior. So if you've ever heard of an open concept, where I student taught was an open concept. So there's no doors on classrooms. And so you can hear and see every single classroom when you walk down the hall. I think it is from like Trotter, Eberly, 70s, 80s type of schooling concept, right? I don't know, 70s. And so we would have kids who would get mad and they would just run out of their classroom. We would have kids who would take chairs and throw chairs from their classroom into like the hallway, and then the whole entire class is disturbed, not just theirs, but like the other 3 classes around. So trying to teach with all the behavior and then dealing with the behavior when kiddos from my own class was causing behavioral type issues. So that probably was the most challenging part. And the proper term for a student exiting a classroom would be called eloping.
Hannah, what would you say was the biggest challenge with teaching?
This might sound super simple, but remembering everything, not everything you do in student teaching, but like keeping records of like assignments that you create or hand out, or like management techniques that you learn from your clinical educators or other teachers in the school, or like ways that, like, I would watch my clinical educator teach sometimes and I'm like, oh, I want to try that, and things like that. And I just was really bad at like taking notes and like saving like extra copies of assignments and things that I created and generated and got off Teachers Pay Teachers. And so like now I'm finding myself like, oh man, like this past week I wanted to do a candy corn activity with addition and subtraction that I did during student teaching, and I could not find it. And so I reached out to my clinical educator. Luckily I have a good relationship with her, and I was like, remember that one assignment that you did? Just like, so my biggest struggle is like, I didn't like take notes and like really process student teaching, and I learned so much that I didn't realize I learned. And so now that I'm doing it all on my own, I'm like, man, how did that work? Or like, what did we use or do? Or like, so my biggest advice too is to take notes, keep a journal, whatever you do. File extra copies of papers and stuff like that. Sounds silly, but it'll help you.
Similar to Alyssa, that learning that grades aren't a motivator, especially in middle school, like not at all. However, parents are, at least in the district I was in. And if parents don't work, grandma and grandpa really do. So learning to like use the community around me in order to encourage a student. First of all, getting the confidence to like, as a student teacher, to contact the parents, grandparents, and then like understanding that I didn't have to do it by myself. That was really hard, but really helpful for this year.
That was all the questions that we had. Thank you so much for showing up on Kaltura. And yes, and Alyssa says, feel free to reach out to any one of us because people say they're going to watch this. So, go Ravens. And